first of all, welcome to the session on driving human rights forward across asset classes. I'm delighted to have you all here to join us today for this 1-hour session, and also very thrilled to have a very various panel of speakers who are going to share their perspectives from different angles on human rights and why human rights due diligence processes and why human rights in the first place is important to investors. Some of the questions to answer and what to really ask companies from, and also what to look for when you go into emerging markets through the private equity lens, and also how to really identify some points of leverage for investors across different asset classes when we talk about human rights and how to integrate human rights into decision making. But first of all, maybe we'll just start off with, what do we mean with human rights? Essentially, it's about the basic dignity of people. And it's really bringing in a more people lens to business and investment. There's a growing awareness of the part of companies that good social performance can translate into a number of positive benefits, from improved business performance to better relationships with communities and local stakeholders wherever the businesses operate. And the recent kind of frameworks and guidelines, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which have also been reflected in the latest OECD multinational guidelines and the responsible business conduct, have all kind of served a bit of a catalyst to really drive the business and human rights agenda, both in the corporate rooms, but also in the investment space. And I'm very thrilled to have this panel today here to really share their perspectives on this. So to my right, I have Annie Bersagel, who's the acting head of responsible investment at KLP, who will share some insights on why they look at human rights and how that actually works in the listed equity space. Next to Annie, I have Rob Wilson, who's the research analyst at MFS, Investment Management, who will also give a bit more of a practitioner's point of view, and actually how do you really integrate human rights into valuation models. And to the end, I have Shami Nissan, who's the Director of Responsible Investment at Actis, who will give that perspective from the private equity space. We'll have, towards the end of the session, we'll have open up to the floor for questions and answers. So we're not using the app for this session, so we'll just, if you have any questions, we'll do the good old tradition of a good show of hands, and we'll have 2 mic runners running around to answer your questions. But first of all, let me start off with an introductory question to all of you, and I'll start off with Annie. Why are human rights really important to KLP as an investor, and how are you going about it?
Great, thanks. My name is Annie Bersagel, and I represent KLP Kapitalforvaltning, which is the asset management arm of KLP, based in Oslo, Norway. And my accent is a little deceptive. I'm from Greeley, Colorado, actually. So we represent Norwegian municipalities. We manage the pension assets of Norwegian municipalities and healthcare organizations, as well as external mutual fund customers. So we're invested in about 3,000 companies globally, so that's going to be a little bit of a contrast, I think, from some of the panelists here. And that definitely shapes the way that we approach human rights. So why is this important to us? This is a part of the guidelines for responsible investment that KLP has. And we have it very clearly in our mandate, we are supposed to get the highest returns for our members, but not at any price. And human rights is a key part of that consideration. And in terms of how we assess human rights issues and how we try to get more leverage kind of in the UN Guiding Principles terminology or influence, first it's important on the assessment angle to stress a couple things. So one is that our assessments are forward-looking. We're engaging often with a view to preventing divestment. We don't want it to get that far. We want to change behavior so that we don't need to divest from a company. And so we are not looking at necessarily at a human rights incident has occurred, but what has the company done to remediate that incident, and what kind of systems have they put in place going forward? And I can give you an example of this. And one company that we've been engaging with, also with other investors, is BHP Billiton, as well as Vale on the Samarco dam disaster from 2015. And there may be some of my fellow investors in the room here who were with us on the trip to Brazil in June to kind of view the site here. But one of the key things with this was this a human rights impact, a severe negative human rights impact? Absolutely. But how is the company manage it afterwards? That's what we're really looking at. What kind of steps did they take to address the families who lost their loved ones in that accident, to move the village that was completely flattened in that incident? And what kind of systems have they put in place to prevent this kind of disaster from happening again? And that's really what we're looking for. And in terms of the kind of systems that we want them to put in place, I mean, we want them to make human rights more boring, if I can say it that way. I mean, you look at kind of a compliance system that a company has, and they have a framework that's very much, or they should have a framework, that's based on a risk-based approach. So this concept of due diligence is maybe a little bit misleading in some contexts, because we're not thinking about the companies on every major transaction, on every project, going into the data room and digging through everything. No, that's not what we're asking for. What we want is we want companies to assess where the highest risks of human rights impacts are, exactly as they do if we're talking about money laundering or any of these other kinds of issues, and to develop their systems designed to detect and prevent and remediate based on that. And then just a point on increasing influence and or leverage, which is such a strange term for the investor community to use leverage. We have basically two main elements for this. I mean, one is the joint engagement. We do that through the Nordic Engagement Cooperation with colleagues from Sweden and from Finland. We also are part of a UN PRI, Human Rights in the Extractive Industries engagement. And I think this is maybe the key part of our approach at KLP in increasing our leverage, is being transparent. And that means both that we list all of the companies that we are engaging with, that we've been in dialogue with, and just basically the issue. I mean, not the meeting minutes, but kind of broadly what we were addressing there, human rights, for example. And we update that on a quarterly basis. So if an NGO comes to us and says, you need to divest from this company, we say, no, we're going to work on active ownership, they can go back and check that we actually did that. And the second part of it with our transparency is also when we do make a divestment, when we decide to exclude a company, that comes with a rationale that's often 5 to 8, 10 pages, explaining exactly which human rights we were talking about, exactly which facts we relied on, all of the citations to the sources for that information, and our dialogue with the companies. And that's what we see really makes a difference, because honestly, the financial impact of KLP divesting from large multinational companies, it means absolutely nothing to them. But it's the reputational impact that comes from that we see is really powerful.
And looking at the reputational impact, Rob, is this something that kind of drives your profile on human rights as well? Or why is human rights important to you at MFS?
Yeah, sure. So I guess maybe the simple but correct answer, at least in our view to that question, is that human rights are important because they absolutely drive stock prices. I mean, we've seen it in a lot of different circumstances. In the US and the UK, you've seen minimum wage and living wage issues driving retail, restaurant securities. Of course, you've got a variety of extractive companies. Just even over the last couple of years here, many examples where human rights issues have impacted those companies operationally. Excuse me. And drug pricing, another good example. In the U.S., over time, or historically as well in emerging markets, issues of drug pricing have been important as well. And in our view, these things in many ways are all human rights related issues and have had material impacts on stock prices. And so that's really the main reason why I think an investor would be interested in these topics, and why I think you'll see more investors moving in this area. For us at MFS, I would say there takes on a little bit of a greater importance potentially because of our investment process. We do have a very long-term oriented process. So just to set the tone there a little bit, I guess, and provide some actual data on that. I mean, our two largest funds at MFS, which are about a third of our assets under management, have a 7-year average holding period for both of those. So the team is really quite interested in understanding any of these topics, whether it's E, S, or G, that could have an impact on the names that they own. And I view a big part of my role now at MFS as the firm's ESG analyst, working with the investment team to integrate these topics, is in many ways focused on the social, the human rights side, because I've certainly found at MFS the team is very interested, always has been, in governance topics, very interested, always has been in environmental topics, and there's a lot of work that the individual team is doing on those topics already. And so this is an area where I think as investors and as those of us that are here attending a conference like this, that is focused on ES&G, focused on responsible investing, that really the human rights angle and the social angle is an area where we can add a lot of value for the investment industry in general and for our firms as well. So, you know, it definitely seems to me that this is an area that we should be digging into more. I guess to wrap it up, so, you know, the answer to that, why is this important? I think it's important because of the impact that these issues have on security prices, and we've seen it time and again, and you'll hear a lot of those examples up here. But I think it does take on sort of particular relevance for longer-term oriented investors as well.
Thank you. And I mean, going into a little bit of a different angle, Shami, I mean, private equity presents its own type of exposure of risk, and especially its own type of human rights exposure of risk. Why is kind of human rights important to actors and the way you invest?
Just to sort of preface my comments with, we're a private equity investor, and we only invest in emerging markets. So I'm going to speak from that lens, and not only because it's relevant to me, but I think everyone here, all of us invest in companies. Many of our companies have supply chains and third-party relationships that somehow inevitably extend into emerging markets. So I think it's important to think of this as a global issue. Why is it important to us? I think, you know, it's similar to what Rob said. At the end of the day, yes, we are a responsible investor and highly committed, and we always have been. But it's more fundamental than that. It's really about value. It's about the value of the assets that we're looking to invest in, the companies that we want to build into successful businesses that we need to scale up. And fundamentally, as a PE house, we need to sell those at a higher price than we bought them. If we have a human rights risk, we're just not going to manage to do that. So yes, reputation is in the mix. People, slightly frustratingly, I think, talk about reputation as the key driver for looking at human rights, but it's all about the value of the company, the value of your investment. Human rights are such an egregious, serious, grave risk if and when they do manifest, that it can not just damage value, but it can obliterate potential investments. And there are some examples of that out there, including a wind farm that never got built in the Oaxaca region of Mexico, for example, because the human rights of the indigenous people were breached. So I think there are examples out there that show how damaging it can be. And for us, it's about the investment case. It's about reputation. It's about building license to operate with communities. We've lived through some of the pain that causes when you don't have that license to operate. And at the bottom of the list of why, I mean, this is a sort of a more minor one, but growing in importance, is the legal side. So in the UK, we have the Modern Slavery Act, and it has various, it takes, you know, other forms of law in some other countries, France, Australia, and state of California. That's starting to become more important, but I sort of put it at the bottom because we would do this anyway without the legal framework.
Exactly, and I think, I mean, the legal driver is something that the human rights space is seeing much more, and, you know, it can, actually promote it a little bit more, but there is also the risk in terms of how that actually then incentivize companies and whether they just do it as a compliance and just legal, or if they actually understand how to build it into the value creation and the value and the belief, as you all actually touched upon a little bit. But
do you mind actually if I just make one comment on that? Because I think one thing that you said really resonated with me at least, and I wanted to just highlight, is this idea of a lot of people view human rights as sort of a reputational risk or a reputational issue. And to me, that almost kind of undermines a little bit of the research research or the work that you could do on human rights, because this idea of a reputational risk is really hard to measure. And it can be easy to almost set aside. And I think what you'll find as you dig into these human rights issues, and as we'll talk, I think, a little bit even on this panel about today, is there are a lot of good, hard data points that you can gather and that you can put together to really form a much more concrete view. So it doesn't have to be a situation of saying, well, I kind of feel this way about the reputational risk, and so maybe I should value the security differently. There can be reputational risks, but there can also be, a lot more, hard data points. Absolutely. And I think that was kind of where you were going, and I think that's just a point that I wanted to kind of bring into relief, because I've seen it many times. If you can focus on, those hard data points, it can really help you in communicating how important, how material, and how, financially material that issue is. So.
Yeah, and actually just on that point around hard data points, and I think this is sometimes something that maybe investors in the room are familiar with, and companies are also facing, building the kind of case internally, because human rights can be quite fluffy, and it can be very broad. It can mean different things to many different people. Yes, the UN guiding principles can help in actually defining it and putting in a little bit of a framework, but Rob, how have you framed kind of human rights issues to build that case for inclusion and really highlight that materiality to analysts and who are actually looking at this, coming in through their portfolio, and actually say, what are you looking for when you look at how to integrate human rights?
Yeah. So I guess there's sort of I would say maybe a three-step process that I've followed on this, and maybe not surprisingly, because of that comment, it does a little bit kind of latch onto that at the beginning here. But so my three-step process is sort of like this. First of all, I try to find some hard data around the human rights issue. Next, I try to create a narrative or what I call sort of a sticky story around that data point. And then third, really make sure I'm translating that data point and that story into what are the value drivers for this business. So let me just kind of unpack those three a little bit. So as we think about hard data points, it can be difficult to find, for all human rights issues, a very clear, a very hard data point on each of these topics. But I think what you'll find is that, if you're thoughtful about it, if you spend some time thinking it through, you'll see some of these things. Maybe it's, a historical controversy that the company has faced, or another in the industry. Maybe it's some industry data point, or, a company data point of some kind. The types of things that I think about in terms of the work that I've done with the team at MFS, some of the data points that I've used are varied. So when I was looking at a hard drive manufacturer several years ago that had a big operation in Malaysia, the hard data point that I used to start things out in my work was a report from the U.S. government that showed that a third of all Malaysian tech labor was under some form of bonding. So that's a good hard data point that when you look at it and you say, here's a company that has a significant portion of its operations in Malaysia, I think most reasonable investors would say, okay, it's unlikely then that company doesn't have, or its suppliers don't have some kind of bonded labor issues. And so it's a good hard data point that helps you kind of start to assess that. Another example might be the beverage company, where you get a map of its operations and a sense of, wow, this particular company has 80% of its operations in areas that are of extreme high water stress right now. Again, a good hard data point using more sort of, maybe in this case, geographic data. Mining companies, again, just trying to kind of help you see the range of the types of data points that I've pulled out, looking at things like, over the last 5 years, how many fatalities has this company had? An unfortunate kind of statistic that you can rely on, but again, these are data points that can help you and have helped me in many cases, really then move to that second point, which is creating a narrative around this, creating a sticky story. And I think this idea of a sticky story is really quite important, because Human rights issues still broadly, I think, are not considered or not considered as closely and as thoughtfully by all investors as they should be. And so to the extent that you can kind of take that data point or those data points that you've gathered and really create a good, strong story around that so that the next time that analyst that you're working with or that portfolio manager is thinking about that company, they're going back to that story and saying, oh wait, I got to ask about this human rights issue, and it doesn't fall off the end of the question list. I think of a good example here of this kind of creating a sticky story is actually my colleague Jeff Marsh that works with me on ESG topics at MFS. He did a great job with this when he was looking at a group of IT contractors. And there was one of these companies that just had a couple of very egregious issues around data privacy and security. And so he highlighted to me and to the analyst and to several portfolio managers, wow, look at this. Here was this, one of the examples was this individual who had taken literally reams of data and just brought it to his house, and his entire shed was full of literally top secret government data. And then there was another employee at this firm that had posted top secret government clearances, again, on a public Amazon cloud server. And these are kinds of the stories, and the way he kind of built it around it, I think, really helped the team remember it, keep it on the top of their minds, and have it be something that really drove our investment decision-making on that particular security. So you've got, the hard data point, you've got the story, and then of course you have to translate that in the end. And I would say this is probably the most important part, is really translating that into, okay, now how is this going to impact the value drivers of the business? Don't expect that the investor is going to do that on their own. I think that's a key piece of the value that we can provide as thinking about this from sort of an ESG or responsible investing standpoint, is to say, okay, don't just say you've got the low Glassdoor rating, right? So that means maybe employees are not very happy. What you need to do is say, well, what's that going to do if they have, low employee satisfaction to their same store sales or their like-for-like sales? How might that, impact their store productivity, i.e. sales per square foot or sales per square meter? And really try to drive that dialogue home to the value drivers of the business. And I think that kind of three-step approach has helped me as it relates to these sort of human rights issues to really kind of frame them and help the team, A, keep them in mind, but B, also recognize how they need to be modeling these things or valuing these things in their own work.
Shami, I want to actually throw the ball to you and just hear, because you've obviously encountered a few stories, case studies, where things have gone wrong, where things have luckily not gone wrong, but you've kind of identified before. Tell us a little bit about those.
I'll share a few stories, but also I think it's worth sort of stating, because I think this topic is so large and kind of can get emotive, and it's worth sometimes helping people to frame it in their minds. And a useful way maybe of thinking about it is, I don't see human rights risk as a separate kind of class of risk. It's a risk that will come out of another risk, an environmental, a safety, other types of social risks. When those risks become so egregious and so severe that they're impacting the ability of an individual or a group of individuals to enjoy their human rights, that's when you have a human right impact, potential or actual, right? So I think it's important to think of it that way. To the extent that you're all thinking about ESG issues, which I'm sure you are, because that's why you're here, this should be one element of that. So you should be asking, your GPs, if you're asset owner, you should be asking all of these questions just to make sure that a holistic approach is being taken to ESG risks and that this isn't falling off the side of the table because it's too complicated or people think it's so rare and, quote, that won't happen to us. So kind of just a preface to a couple of examples, I guess, of where I wouldn't say that I've seen human rights risks in action, but I've definitely seen them on the cusp of happening. And I guess for me, for Actis as a PE investor in emerging markets, what I'm trying to do is make sure that we're avoiding the worst thing possible all the time. And if there are incidents or signals that we are going into the domain of something that might evolve into a human rights risk, that the appropriate mitigation and corrective action plan is put in as soon as possible. But just to give you kind of like a sense of the kind of stuff that I've seen, looking at a construction site in India being corralled almost manfully by people down a certain route of things that I should see that they had prepared, and kind of saying, no, actually I want to go over there. And seeing something that might not be obvious, but the standards of accommodation for the laborers, for the workers in the camps, the amount of space that they have to use their free time, whether they have anywhere to sleep, to rest out of the sun, 45 degrees C. Are they getting enough drinking water? Do they get paid for overtime? How is overtime measured? All of that stuff. I've seen labor accommodation standards that are woefully inadequate of anything that would be deemed sort of fit or appropriate. And I'm not seeking 5-star luxury hotel, right? But some of the, I don't want to call it kind of almost like shelters, which are the rest areas, where basically just bits of like corrugated tin roof cobbled together, and you couldn't actually enter it standing up. So you'd have to go on your hands and knees to crawl into this thing, which was probably hotter than it was outside anyway. So those are the kinds of things that are obviously really, really red flags. But equally, not always, no offense to the consultants in the room, can be missed sometimes, very easy to miss. And if someone has something to hide, like in those situations, it can be really, really hard to spot, because by definition, they're working hard to make sure you don't see it. And we've all heard stories about factories where, when a certain music or song comes on, that's the signal for the kids to run out the back door. So there's all kinds of tactics that are at play, and I think you have to go in with your eyes wide open. Other things that I guess I've come across is I did a DD visit a few months ago to a site in Mexico. It transpires that the current owners of this site have not had a single iota of engagement with an indigenous Mexican tribe that is highly protected, whose pilgrimage to a holy site literally goes through this facility. So, the thoughts that I have to, or the thinking that I have to do around that is, what would we have to do if we went down this route of investing in that before, during, and after, to make sure that we are doing everything according to international best practice, which in this case would probably be the IFC performance standards, in terms of getting appropriate consultation, engagement, and ultimately consent, true consent from this set of disadvantaged and protected peoples, who we are potentially impacting quite negatively. I'll stop there, Bettina.
Thank you. And I actually want to kind of build on maybe that, you mentioned kind of seeing the actual human rights impact on the ground, or at least preventing them before they happen and just at the cusp. And going back to you, Annie, and going to your point around how you're looking at this, and it's very forward-looking, and you've got 3,000 companies that you've got there, and how do you really prioritize the real human rights issues in those? And how, are you looking at kind of the most severe human rights impacts, or are you looking at it from a more materially financial risk perspective?
Well, I think, for the active investments, to the extent that there are human rights issues that are financially material, that should be covered already. And my experience with a lot of our PMs is that they recognize these issues, but they don't necessarily call them human rights impacts. An example is one of the companies that we're engaging with through the PRI, they have a labor conflict so severe that they've had a work stoppage at their mine for 7 years. If your PM doesn't notice that, she should be fired. But in terms of, for most of the passive investments, and what we do in my team is a lot of focusing on severity, and I guess you could say salience, and kind of the salient human rights impacts in the language of the UN guiding principles. Because that's really an important shift that comes in the guiding principles, is that we're not talking about the impact on us as an investor. We're talking about the impact on the affected stakeholders. And that's what we're looking at. And so that means that we can focus just as much on an engagement with Evergreen Marine in Taiwan about shipbreaking as we would with Royal Dutch Shell on the Niger Delta, because it's based on the severity of the impacts. And I also want to push back on the idea that that there is a financial material, that all these human rights impacts are going to be financially material in a positive way. I mean, one thing that we've seen in the Norwegian market, where shipping is a major industry, yet the majority of the world's tonnage is dismantled on the beaches of Bangladesh and India and Pakistan. And often it's just the ship is just driven up onto the beach, disassembled piece by piece by workers with just a blowtorch and very, very minimal safety equipment. You've probably seen these pictures in National Geographic, and really not much has changed. And there are opportunities for ship owners to dismantle their vessels in a responsible way. They can send them to facilities in China, in Turkey, that do have fixed installations where they can dismantle the ships. But that's going to cost an extra $3 to $7 million per ship. That's money just right out of the company today. You could say maybe that's going to have an impact over the long term, but that's not obvious. But what we see, and especially from a lot of the Norwegian ship owners, is that they say, this is a part of my integrity. And I don't think there's anything wrong to say that. Maybe it's a bit different from reputation. It's not fear of the media so much as, these are often companies with substantial family ownership, and I don't want my name there. I don't want to see, the company's name on the side of this ship going onto the beaches of Bangladesh. So I'd push back a little bit on that notion that there's this kind of correlation there. To the extent that there is, I think we're all on board and we're all going the same way, and it's a far easier discussion. But I think it's also important to maintain these kind of regulations and be very clear on what you stand for when that's not obvious.
Rob, would you like to add some comments on that in terms of, the actual barriers and the pushback?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are barriers. There is pushback, and maybe my first thought as I kind of think about some of those comments is, you're right. I mean, there are definitely going to be a lot of topics that are human rights related that may not have the obvious sort of financial angle to them, I guess. And there are a lot that will have that. For us, our goal is absolutely to work as hard as we can to assess all of the financial impacts and be thinking through these other topics that at some point could have a material impact. And what I've found and is that there are a lot of challenges, a lot of barriers to even getting adoption around topics that are financially material. And so there's a lot of ground to cover here, I guess, is what I would say. Like, I think about the idea of certainly a lot of our portfolio managers do have a good sense for the human rights issues that are impacting their securities. And if it's that, mine that has been stopped for 7 years or something, they'll know about it. I guess part of what I think our role is to be able to help them weigh those issues properly. So the example that I gave earlier of that IT contractor, where they had several instances of data security related issues that to us suggested serious internal control issues. Well, the analysts and the portfolio managers knew that data security was a little bit of an issue there, and there had been some high profile issues in the past that really hadn't moved the stock all that much. But we didn't feel, as a team, weighing them properly in their overall analysis. And so I think that's what we were able to come in and help them do, is weigh that a little bit more heavily, helping us to avoid the stock, which it was actually just about a month after we looked at it that it was down 20% as a result of a variety of internal control issues that they were being investigated for by the federal government of the U.S. So I think helping to weigh these issues properly, helping the portfolio managers and analysts to really cut through and see where the financial materiality lays is a key piece of what we're trying to do, and that weighing process is a little bit of a challenge or a barrier. Some of the other challenges and barriers that I see to considering this is, unfortunately, there is a sort of historical lack of market reaction in some cases, not just to breaking of large ships, which of course is a problem, but also look at things like the Rana Plaza disaster from a few years ago. I mean, this was 1,100 people who were killed in a factory collapse. And there's academic research that suggests there was no financial impact. In fact, for one company, PRI, it may have actually had this research suggests may have had a positive impact because people read the news and they said, oh wow, Primark, they sell t-shirts for £1, maybe I should go there. I mean, so that is a challenge, and it is, and I think this is what this community can be working towards, is how do we help the financial community to see that these things are more material. And there's plenty of others. I mean, there's I think a lot of other things. Analysts and portfolio managers maybe not accustomed to looking for information in some of the specialized sources that are out there now that a lot of investors don't necessarily go to. Again, these are the kinds of things that I think we can connect the investment industry to, so that over time, as we move further on these human rights issues, we can get to the point where these topics are being modeled and valued, even if it is something that may not have the financial impact now, and certainly could in the future if we continue down the path.
Shami, just for your kind of perspective from the emerging markets and all the different human rights issues, and how do they really differ in the different, you referred to some case studies and you referred to especially Mexico, but how, looking back at how to prioritize the human rights impacts, how are they different in the different investments, and how do you really manage them in that sense?
I guess, it comes down to having a really structured DD approach. And this is really hard to do due diligence right, because it's not the same old traditional due diligence. Because you need to, if you're going to properly look at human rights issues, you need to look at them from the point of view of the rights holder. And most diligence is about what's the risk to the business entity that you're going to invest in or buy a stock in or what have you. So it's a different kind of due diligence if you're going to do proper human rights due diligence. That's the number one thing. The number two thing is that you have to think about it in terms of a sense of ongoing risk, right? So you might have assessed that at that moment in time there might not be a severe risk, but you can't just sort of put your pen down and be like, okay, well, I've looked at it this side of the investment or this side of the decision, and therefore I don't have to look at it again. You need some kind of mechanism to have the ability to monitor those human rights on an ongoing basis if you are in the sphere where you are dealing with a sector or a country where you know that those issues are endemic and heightened to begin with. And that's where for PE it's somewhat easier. We have controlling stakes, we're long-term investors. If we say, a CP to us investing in you is that you're going to do the following things, then it just happens. And those are the easy days and the happy days. And we can tell if it happens because we're sitting on the board. It's much more difficult if you have resistance from management. And I think at that point, if you're eyeballing people who are starting to give you a level of resistance on what you're saying, it's a kind of walk away moment for us. Because if you don't, you can put it in the contracts and you can make it an issue of using your clauses to force them to do something, but if you don't have the alignment and the mindset, and if you think that the CEO or management of the company is not really going to do these things to the extent that you need them to, for us that's a deal breaker. I think so I think it's difficult, and I think the other sort of thing that makes human rights diligence, risk assessment hard, and I struggle with this, is just the question of how far do you go, right? So you're looking at a company, it has 800 distributors, and those have sub-distributors, and are you going to go to the fourth tier, number 72 company? No, you can't do that. It's not defensible. Coming up with an intelligent, defensible way to do your risk assessment can be really difficult. There's no easy right answers, but working with specialist is the way to start. There's some guidance out there, but you kind of have to reframe the problem every time and innovate the solution every time.
We're going to open the floor very soon for any questions, so feel free to warm up your thoughts on what questions to ask. But just on that, actually, would you like to share your thoughts as well, Annie, on that? Basically, the focus on how far do you really go? Where does it stop? How is that something that you're facing when you then also try to speak to your PMs on this and actually try to identify that the mine has been shut for 7 years, and how are you actually realizing it, and how do you really look at that?
Yeah, so I think the challenges for us in assessing it is, we're looking at it from are these human rights, are they serious or systematic? So it's not every human rights violation. I mean, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you have language in there about, for example, having periodic vacations and that kind of thing. Would we say, oh, this company is out of our portfolio because they don't give their employees enough vacation time? No, it doesn't rise to that level. And also, what is the contribution of the company to the human rights issue? So the fact that a company is, for example, operating within a country where they have the death penalty for homosexuals, does that mean that we're going to divest from the company? No, I mean, there would have to be some kind of link that would indicate that they were somehow complicit or contributing to that violation. And this can be a really difficult exercise when you're looking at things like companies that are doing some kind of work for a project that is in violation of human rights standards. How far do you go? What about project financing? Okay, project financing, let's say if you go that far and say that is going to be considered a contribution to a human rights violation. What about other types of financing to the projects? What about minority shareholdings? Suddenly, are we not able to invest in the financial sector at all? And I don't mean to say that to kind of minimize the concerns, but there are a lot of dilemmas that we see coming in that space. And I think that's where we find the toughest cases. That and then really getting a handle on the facts is often one of the most difficult parts. I mean, we are not, in the majority of cases, not like Shami able to go down to the country and do a due diligence on our own part. I mean, we're relying on sources out there, and especially when we're talking about jurisdictions that may not have a free media, where you may not be able to rely on, say, court documents that come from those areas. That can be a real challenge in figuring out exactly what has happened.
Tina, just a quick comment on the issues that Annie's raised about scope and data. I mean, bribery and human rights are similar. Everyone's going to hide it from you if they're doing it, right? I mean, there was one company we were looking at, and we couldn't find anything in the track record to make us really work. Like, we didn't have the data that anything had happened. But the same group owned a different company where there were documented human rights abuses. So we didn't go anywhere near it, even though we weren't going to be touching at all the other one. And that was mining and DRC, and you kind of don't get uglier than that, really, when it comes to human rights. So we thought about the owners, and we were like, you know what, if they can do that over there, even though we haven't found anything wrong over here, I think not, thank you. So, but like you said, every time the dilemma is a different thought process.
Well, and it comes down to a little bit of what you were saying earlier, I think, is this idea of, wait a minute, I want to go over there. And that's true in your context. It sounds like it's true in a public equity context as well, of it is very hard to get a handle on these facts. And so you have to be a little creative, and maybe this is even a barrier to broader adoption within the investment industry, is this idea of saying, okay, this is sort of what the investment industry is telling me, or traditional investment sources are telling me, but I actually want to go over there. And as you said, look at this other company that's owned by the same family, and how are they operating, and how might that influence my viewpoint of the company that I'm actually looking at? Or I do want to go and look at this other investor who has decided to exclude a specific company and understand why. And is that a different viewpoint than maybe we've already gathered on this particular security? And so that is a big piece, I think, of the job, is saying, no, I want to go over there. I want to look at something a little different than kind of a traditional investment data point or information might provide.
Really thinking a little bit outside the box, and kind of see how to actually draw on different sources, and then to patch up, I guess, as robust data as you can, essentially. We've heard a lot of different perspectives from different angles. I'd like to open up to the floor and hear some of your thoughts and questions, because I'm conscious that it's a quite full room of different angles. So we'll take the first question down on the third row. Gentleman there, and then two in the back, and then the front.
Should be on. Okay. It's Matt Crossman from Rathbones. Thank you to the panel for your comments. Just want to raise the issue of asset classes. It seems to me that we're talking about a relatively mature debate when it comes to liquid equity, listed equity, and private equity. But what about the other asset classes, particularly kind of fixed interest and debt holder kind of in negotiations?
Mm-hmm. So what about other asset classes and how that manifests themselves? And there were two in the back. We'll do three in one go, and then.
Hi, Ken McPhail from University of Manchester. Thanks again for the insights from the panel. I was really interested in the different examples that you gave across the different sectors. I'm particularly informed by this morning's talk. I'm really interested to know whether and how driving human rights can be picked up, particularly within the tech sector and social media and IT areas. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And I think just the last one.
Michael O'Connor from First Super Australia. I was wondering if the panel member was giving an example of maybe through their research where they've consulted or asked questions of organised labour about some of the human rights issues.
I didn't catch that.
Yeah.
Sorry, could you just repeat that
Questions
again?
on.
The last one.
Labour, was it?
Whether, sorry, you want me to repeat the question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, whether you've dealt with organised labour when investigating investments, whether you've had any contact with organised labour, is it part of your process? And if it is, giving an example of how it worked or didn't work.
Right, so that question was on how do you actually deal with organised labour. Should we start off maybe with that one and then go through the other one? Anyone wants to join in? How you actually look at organised labour in parts of your investments?
Do you mean sort of right to collective bargaining and that sort of thing?
Yes.
Yeah. I did have an interesting conversation at a site once where I asked if they had a worker grievance mechanism because it had come to my attention that some of the workers were leaving handwritten notes in the pockets of visitors saying, help us, kind of. And I said to them, why aren't you having like a worker grievance mechanism or, some sort of, and he said, well, that would be like opening Pandora's box. It's like, that's the point. But, so yes, we absolutely look at that. And as you can imagine, for me, I'll let my panelists answer. Emerging markets labor issues are huge on all kinds of levels, whether it's inequality, discrimination, women, pay, overtime. I've been told, but, if people have very long working hours, then I sort of try and introduce the concept of, well, why not have some breaks? I'll say, no, they want to do that work because they need the money. And so there's also very deeply embedded cultural issues there as well. What we basically require all our companies to sign up to and implement is a worker grievance mechanism, a community grievance mechanism, because often your workers and your community are one and the same thing, and a corporate level whistleblower mechanism. So we build in all of those kinds of defenses. We also mandate for them to have kind of councils and working groups that worker representatives sit on. And they also, in the energy and infrastructure space where we see most of this risk coming to light, they have to have a subcommittee to the board as a company that I, for example, or someone else at Actis would sit on. And labor, social worker issues would be a standing agenda item on that. So that's a lever to make sure that there's appropriate governance and senior level scrutiny of those issues on an ongoing basis, i.e. at least quarterly.
So I'll take that last question next. And for us, I mean, it's absolutely been part of the mosaic for a lot of different securities that we've looked at. I think of a couple, a consumer discretionary company in Canada that has had a variety of labor-related issues. We've gone and looked at, what the labor unions and organizations in Canada have had to say about that particular company to gain a better assessment of sort of the overall way that the company is managing its people and its sort of governance approach. Same kind of thing that we've done for actually a can manufacturer that operates on a global basis that had some issues in the United States and then was moving into some other areas where labor and unions have much stronger power, and so that was part of our dialogue with them. So it's absolutely, again, this is one of those kind of going back to the question that we were talking about just before the Q&A of going out and looking at differentiated sources of information And I think labor groups in many regions of the world, and all of them, frankly, provide some very interesting data points that I think a lot of investors are not looking at, perhaps because they allow their sort of political views to overrun, the right thing to do from an investment standpoint, or maybe they just feel they're not relevant, I'm not sure. But it is absolutely, in many cases, a very interesting source of and providing you with additional data points on a variety of companies that we've looked at.
Again, just briefly with that, so we have contact with labor unions regularly about these kinds of issues. In fact, there was one that brought up to our attention some concerns relating to a very large German logistics company that we've been engaging with for quite a while now on their organized labor issues. Another example is Vinci in France. So we're together with the Nordic Engagement Cooperation. We've been engaging with them on how they ensure that the workers for their projects in Qatar that their labor rights are respected and that they have the freedom to organize, even though, as many of you may well know, labor unions as such are not allowed in the country. So they've had to find kind of alternative ways to allow for worker representation. And maybe the largest example of a case we worked with is actively engaging with Walmart and trying to get them back into our portfolio. And that's maybe an important point to name here, in that there's often this kind of dichotomy presented that either you engage or you divest, and we see them really as kind of complementary measures, where when we've divested from a company, we're often very eager to engage with them to get them to come back into the portfolio. Where Walmart is an example of a company that's made a lot of progress on many areas, particularly on the environment, and we are still waiting on the organized labor issue, and the ball is really in their court.
And the question around how actually to apply human rights across different asset classes, maybe just a quick thought from maybe more you and Rob, I guess, and how you actually look at that.
I can real quickly, back it up. For fixed income, it's the same as we do for listed equity. So, we'd reach out if we have a case that's involving a company in which we're only invested in fixed income, we would engage with them the same way. But most of the time, we also have listed equities in them. And for private equity, I think the main tool that we use is, as a limited partner, we use a side letter where it specifies that if the company is involved in serious or systematic human rights violations, that we have the opportunity to be an excused investor.
I guess maybe the quick answer on that is what we've typically found is that you need a little bit of a higher level of materiality to drive security pricing in the fixed income world, and so that would be maybe the main difference in terms of looking at it from a fixed income standpoint, and that's really, for MFS, equity and fixed income are our two asset classes. That's where I could comment.
And just linking Ken's question around human rights cases and the, how that can be applied to technology and social media and the vehicles of that. How are you dealing with that sector across the board?
I guess I'm happy to start. I think we're starting to see society deal with what I call sort of tech ethics. And I think it's actually a topic that is really ripe for the PRI, for ESG investors to kind of take in and start thinking about these topics around fake news, or providing a platform for various groups that are looking to undermine society or certain groups or whatever it may be. These are things that I think are very much human rights issues, and that the tech industry is going to need to deal with, and they're starting to, but in many cases I don't think necessarily really approaching what they're ultimately going to have to do to avoid greater issues. But it still feels as if we're a little bit in the early innings of seeing that play out, so I don't necessarily have an example that comes to the top of my mind from an engagement or...
Just a quick comment from me. I think the whole cyber risk agenda is embryonic, and I think we, as a community of responsible investors, need to get our act together on it fast. I'm not convinced that it's our job to do that in isolation, because very few of us in this room are probably IT or tech experts. But the problem with this is that when you have these kind of kind of like pan-discipline risks. You know, they don't seemingly belong to anyone, and there's a risk they're going to fall through the cracks, and they kind of tend to get lobbed over to the RI people. Like, what are you doing about cyber? And I was like, what, is that my job now? But it has to be somebody's job, and there are absolutely ESG and human rights risks linked to it, but it transcends ESG. And I think we all need to think as responsible investors, what are we going to do about that and how are we going to tackle it? I think that started, but we need to go faster.
And so we have one example of Yahoo has been previously excluded from KLP's investments from I think about 2007, 2008 was whenever the issue was involved the company providing information on a human rights dissident in China to someone who was later arrested and tortured. And the key for those kind of cases, one of the things that's really difficult is assessing the company's contribution there. The company was re-included in our investments again in 2014. If you followed the stock price, that was not very opportune timing. But the two main challenges, I think, with the technology sector, and I do anticipate we'll have more of these cases going forward, assessing the company's contribution. You know, is this like the mail system where you don't hold the post responsible for what's in the contents of the letter? I mean, I think obviously we've come beyond that, but how far do we go beyond that, and what kind of responsibilities do we put on companies? Because there we have to see there's a major transatlantic divide in how we approach this from a regulatory perspective as well. And the other main issue that is perhaps somewhat related to this is that we're often talking about human rights in conflict here, where it can be something like freedom of expression versus concerns about hate speech or, you know, violations of the Convention on Racial Discrimination. And how do you delineate between those interests, and how do you decide what you're going to do for those interests? So that's going to be a challenge for a lot of companies as well. You know, not the investors. We're getting this a bit on the back end, I think.
Yeah. I'm conscious there was one question next to Ken. I just want to do a final quick round of questions because we've got 2 minutes left. So the gentleman next to Ken, and then the lady in the front.
Niklas from Norway. Just a quick question then, if you want to comment on how companies respond to the engagement, and if you have some good examples of where they have responded positively to human rights engagement. Great.
Quick one that to you. We'll just do that, and then the lady in the front on the second row, and then we'll speed through. So how do actually companies respond? And yes.
I wonder, I'm wondering if you haven't thought about talking with companies about their business model, because everything we hear here on the human rights violations is the outcome of a business model of a company that's trying to put pressure on the supply chain to make products in a very cheap way, and it goes down and goes down and it goes down. And I think there will be a good link between corporate governance and this, because when you have a business model that will work on a sustainable long-term business, and not only at shareholder value, because everyone is working on shareholder value, then you will get another business, you get other things, and you don't have to put that much pressure on your supply chain. And I wonder if you as investors or as asset managers would like to discuss their business model, because that is the main cause of all the problems.
Thank you. So company responses, and how do you encourage a more sustainable business model?
Sure, maybe I'll take that second one perhaps first. Just for me, that a big piece of that framework is the, as I mentioned, you got to find the data points. You have to create a story to kind of keep people thinking about it, and then you need to be able to translate this to the value drivers of the business. And for us, that is a big part of the reason why we focus on what we think is financially material, because it does drive some focus. It drives focus among the investment team, and it certainly drives focus among the management teams as well, to be able to say, hey, here's this particular topic that we think is going to have an impact on, as you say, your business model in this way, and here's what we think the potential impacts could be. So I think you're right. You absolutely have to link these things back to the business model, to the value drivers of the business, so that you create that that agreement among the investors and the company that yes, this is material, yes, it could have an impact, and I think you made some comments in there about a link to governance as well. Absolutely, I think that is a part of a lot of these issues as well. A company that's going to take these seriously, if you can create that strong link, is also one that probably has good governance structures in place and is able to manage a lot of different issues well.
Honey?
I can just answer those two together, actually. So the way that companies respond to us often reflects how integral the human rights issue is to their business model. And I'd say that perhaps that's one of the strengths, actually, if I'm going to push back a little bit on the theory that this is all based on the business model. Often we see human rights issues that arise more from a lack of oversight than anything. And it involves a very small part of the organization. I mean, we had engagement with Total that we excluded the company based on their exploration for oil off the coast of Western Sahara. This was a tiny part of their activities, and they did eventually stop doing that. They sold the license. They will never tell you that it was based on their influence, and we will never know. But it's clear that's a little bit easier than engaging with Philip Morris to stop producing tobacco. But we have also had reception from companies of, and investors care about this, and that they're just kind of bemused. And I think maybe my favorite example of where, really kind of clueless, and I'm not going to name the company here for that reason, is one company that presented this new human rights policy that they developed for the entire conglomerate. I asked, okay, well, could you just walk us through how that applies to this specific case that we're looking at? Oh, no, this is intended to be a very high-level policy. It's not supposed to apply in specific cases. That told us a lot about their governance structure as well.
Yeah, exactly. Shami, any concluding views?
I don't know, I'm just thinking about the business model ones. I think some you can change and others you can't. I mean, we invest in a lot of wind farms. The places that you can build wind farms tend to be non-urban, rural, obviously windy, tend to be in the middle of nowhere, but usually there's some communities nearby. In the markets, in the parts of the globe where the wind blows the strongest, we have a lot of land problems in that people don't have formal land rights. And then as a wind developer, you're asking yourself, right, this is the bit of land where we can build this sustainable low-carbon asset and create lots of jobs, etc. How do you buy land legitimately from people that don't own it legitimately? So you get into that whole thing. I mean, that's never going to, in the foreseeable, that model is not going to change, for example, in that case. But I thought of it because when we had this situation in Honduras, we had 200 small farmers with like tiny little micro plots all together that were involved in this. And we ended up spending literally thousands of hours of lawyer time to actually get them for the first time in their lives land title so that we could have a leasing arrangement with them, so that they could have a source of income, transform the future stability of their families. And we also, taking out all the morality out of it, had a de-risked project that we could sell on. So there are times when you can work within the parameters, but because you can't always change the model. But yeah, I take your point.
So sadly, in the interest of time, we've been running over time, but it's been interesting to really hear the different perspectives, how to really create that narrative, build it internally, create a sticky story, and really, integrate that, and actually also look at human rights risks not just as a separate category of risk, but actually it stems out of a lot of environmental, social, and governance risk in general. So I'd like to just thank you all for joining the session, and also join me in thanking the panel for this exciting session.